Hey guys, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and today we're going to be making a live edge side table with hairpin legs. I used epoxy resin to fill all of the voids in this piece of wood. This project was my first time ever using resin, and it was a lot easier than I thought it would be. If I can do it, then you can do it, and I'm gonna show you how. Let's get started. For the full list of products and materials used on this project, you can click on the link below this video to visit my website and to find the step-by-step tutorial. I found this piece of wood on eBay and I just knew I had to have it. It was unique and funky, and it was actually pretty rotted and unstable, which meant that I would have to use resin to stabilize the piece anyway. Before I could even think about applying resin to this piece, I had to do some prep work. I sanded down the top with about 120 grit finish and then used a wire brush to remove any of the excess grit and grime that was on the piece. I then used my shop vac to remove any excess dust, because the next step is really important. Next, I just use plain old brown packaging tape to tape up the top of the tabletop. Because I want my first layer of resin to be flush with the tabletop, this is a really important part to the process. I was afraid that the packaging tape would not be strong enough, so I actually used just a regular old butane torch to heat the air above the tape and melt the tape to the piece. Once the tabletop was prepped, it's time for the resin. I found this resin on Amazon for about 50 bucks and just followed the instructions on the back of the bottles for the ratio to mix. After mixing for a while, I then added some pigment for some color and then mixed essentially until my hand fell off. Once the epoxy resin was mixed enough, I then applied it to the piece. As you can see, I did flip the piece over, so I'm pouring directly onto the sticky side of the tape here. I also wanted to make sure that I didn't pour more than about 1/8 of an inch at a time, because this is the most important layer of the piece and it needed to dry perfectly. After my first pour was complete, I used my torch to just run it over the piece and remove all the bubbles from the epoxy. The torch does not need to touch the epoxy, but the heat will bring the bubbles upward and out. After following the instructions on the resin that I purchased and after waiting about 4 hours, I then poured a second layer of the epoxy into the piece. This time I was a little more generous and went about 1/4 of an inch because I knew that this layer would not show through the tabletop as much as the last layer did. I also made sure to get the little guys. Can't forget the little guys. I then used my torch once more to remove any bubbles from this layer as well. So after about 8 hours of sleep and what felt like an eternity, I was finally able to pour my last layer of resin into the piece. I decided not to use any pigment in this pour because you can't really see it through the table anyway, and it just didn't make sense to waste it. I did make sure to still use the torch though, because I just didn't want any bubbles to just happen to peek through the piece. I really wanted it to be as perfect as possible. And then once I was happy with everything, I just allowed the piece to cure for 12 hours as per the recommendation on the bottles. Once the piece was dry, I flipped it over and removed the tape. It was so satisfying, but also so frustrating. I totally underestimated how sticky the tape would be, and it was really difficult to remove. So first I tried scraping it off with a razor, and then when I realized that wasn't working, I decided to use some rubbing alcohol and a paper towel to just remove the rest of the sticky residue. It actually worked perfectly. Next, I mixed up a brand new batch of the epoxy resin with the blue tint to fill in the voids on the top of the table. These are voids that did not go all the way through the piece, so they were not reached by the pour that I did on the other side of the tabletop. I actually had a few holes that were really stubborn, and they just kept sucking up whatever epoxy I was pouring in. So I decided to use some fast drying wood adhesive to plug up the holes. Once the adhesive had dried, it then prevented the wood from sucking up the excess epoxy, and I was able to pour with no problem. Finally, it was time to let the piece cure for 12 hours and then on to sanding. In case you didn't know, I love sanding. This is my sarcastic face, so this should be interesting. Please wish me luck. I'll see you at the end. Next is what felt like an eternity of sanding. It was just a forever process. But essentially what I did is I just used my belt sander and 80 grit sandpaper to remove as much material as I could on the first pass. I also made sure to wear a dust mask and use my shot vac here because resin is super toxic to your lungs, so please be safe. After a couple hours of sanding, and when I finally was at a spot in which I was happy with, I decided to transfer over to a less aggressive sander and then sand the piece consecutively from 80 grit all the way until 500 grit. This removed all of the gouges in the resin and made it super smooth. I then just wiped down the piece with some water and a cloth to see what it looked like, and this is when I got super excited. I really wanted to use a food-safe finish on this table since everything in my apartment doubles as something else, and I know I'll be using this for entertaining. So I used some Rubio Monocoat, and it just made this piece come to life. It was seriously incredible. As you can see, the application process is pretty simple. I just squeegeed on the finish, I let it sit for a while, and then I wiped the excess finish off with a clean rag. I also made sure to apply the finish to the side of the table as well. It just really brought out the cool, rough, rustic look of the grain. Because Rubio is pretty much dry to the touch after applying, I was able to then bring the table to my apartment, apply legs, and display it proudly. Not so bad for my first pour project. What do you think? For more project ideas, please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also check out my website at DIYHuntress.com. As always, thank you so much for watching and happy DIYing.